So it's Sunday morning and I walk into a church. It's a set up and tear down church. They meet in a community center in my community. Immediately I walk up and I see the gentleman with the biggest, brightest smile on his face, and he introduces himself and he's the senior pastor here at this location. I coyly say to him, I don't have time to talk right now, but I would love to connect with you after the service, knowing that I want to get a sense of what this church is about and who he is as a leader. After church, he walks up to me and he says, "Hey, do you have any questions about this church?" And because I have church planning experience myself, I said, "Yeah. What size trailer do you guys use to set up and tear down all this stuff?" And he was shocked. He's like, "Of all the questions, you asked that." And I said, "Well, don't tell anybody. I was a church planner back in California." He's like, "Really? I'd love to talk." I'm like, "I would love to talk too." So 3 days later, we find ourselves having lunch in a very wide open restaurant. And as I tell him the story of why I ended up in Standing Stone, he starts to weep. And he starts to cry because he's so overwhelmed with everything going on in his life. His organization wants him to church plant, leaving the communities that he's embedded in. His community is foundational for him and his family's success and their stability. His wife is pregnant with their 4th child. And everything in him says, I either please the church and put my family in great peril, or I please my family and I put my church responsibility in great peril. So I asked him if he'd like to talk further about it. He said, absolutely. So we sat down the very next week and he shared with me all of the pushback that he has for church planning. I calmly walked him through the process of saying, hey, you don't have to share all of these answers and all these questions with your superiors. Just provide them with the answers that they ask for. Fast forward the next 2 weeks, they had a big meeting with his supervisors, and he comes out of it, calls me right away. He's like, "Lo, you're never gonna guess what happened." I'm like, "What happened?" And he said, "They said there's too many questions. They said there's too many unknowns, and they're not ready to church plant." And at that point, I actually asked them, "Well, what are your questions? Maybe I can add some insight." And they proceeded to outline all these questions that this young pastor had the answers to. And as he systematically answered all these questions, they said, "You're too valuable for us to send you out to church plant. What would you feel about staying put where you're at this church, and becoming our director of church expansion and using all of your knowledge to equip and send other pastors into these communities?" His mind was blown, but the story doesn't end there. 6 months later, I visit this church again, because I like to pop in and check in on my pastors. And I'm checking my children in their kids ministry. And as I'm scattered and trying to get Eliana and Malachi to calm down, I'm giving my information to the gal that's checking them in. And before I know, she's no longer at the desk, but she's standing right next to me. She gives me this huge hug. And I'm like, "Hi." And she goes, "Did you say your name is Lo Norris?" And I said, "Yeah." And she's like, "I'm so-and-so's wife." It was the pastor's wife. And I didn't know that they were talking. I didn't know that he was sharing the journey that he and I were having with her. But in that moment, I got one of the greatest gifts that doesn't always happen in Standing Stone, was to see the outcome. And the outcome that ripples through not just the pastor's life, but his family's life, his children's life, the community life. And in that moment, I realized this is just incredible work that we get to do. And I was so glad that God put me in a situation where I could show up at that little set up and tear down church. And just as a sidebar, they are no longer set up and tear down. They've bought a new house. They are established. Their 4th child's here and healthy. And it just feels great to be part of that stabilizing effort for the pastors in my community.